Okay, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to talking with you and learning with you today. This session is really, I guess you get two versions or two doses of sort of Q&A that I know will happen later. I really want this to be more of an organic conversation, and so if you have questions, I will repeat the question because I think it's being, and we have a mic there as well. And I'll repeat those questions so that people out in the virtual world might be able to hear from us as well. So I want to start by just asking. I wanted to get a sense of there's a lot more people in here than normal, right? So I wanted to kind of get a sense of who's in the room. So what I'll do is I'll ask you if you are in special education. Raise your hand. All right. So that's the majority of you. Okay. If you're in elementary, raise your hand. Okay. Secondary, a few secondary math, secondary literacy, ELA. Okay, a few. Okay. All right. That helps. That helps me a lot. Early childhood, have a few early childhood as well. What else did I miss? Okay. Early childhood, let me see one more time. Okay. All right, great. All right, good. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome. I'm so glad you all are here. So I want to give us an opportunity to pose questions, and then if nobody poses questions, I do have slides that you will get as well, so I can go through those. But what are some of the areas or issues that you want us to delve more deeply into during this session? What questions do you have? Yes. And just, yeah, and I'll repeat, yeah.
So my question was in regards to, like, you were talking about the pictures that were in that office. So I heard this, I don't remember where I heard this, I think it was on the radio. There was a teacher who got really bad feedback from a parent because she was, I think we all know, or some of us might know who Bad Bunny is. She was playing music of his, but in like a song that was like teaching the kids how to, I think it was like clean up or something. And so my question is like, how do you go about that when a parent is like fighting against what you're trying to do is give that student like an image of themselves in the classroom?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that's important. Yeah. So it's so complex. There's a lot in it. So maybe give her the microphone.
What a great idea.
Thank you, because I want to make sure I capture it well. Thank you.
So to shorten everything I said, for the example was there was a teacher who was putting Bad Bunny music, but in terms of like teaching the students how to clean up, and she got a lot of bad feedback from certain parents, and like they rebutted against it. So how would you go about like parents who are giving you that bad feedback of trying to give a different student a mirror of themselves in a classroom?
Yeah, well, I think, thank you for the question. I think what's really important to remember is you bring a level of expertise and insights as the educator. But I think it's also important to realize that we're not the arbiter of knowledge and knowing. So even though you're going through this outstanding teacher education program, you're developing some insights, the feedback that you get from parents should be taken seriously, right? And so part of, now you might not agree with the feedback, and we might all agree that the parent is absolutely wrong, right? But the parent has a right to provide that feedback to you in the education of their children. And so I think one of the things that you have to do is you have to work with and provide educative opportunities for parents to understand that what you're doing is really a function of what we know from good science, what we know from the research. But then there are also moments when you might need to shift, right? And that shifting then becomes a place where parents will work more, in community with you. So, this idea that you certainly want the best for your children, for the students in your class, but parents, family members, and so forth are going to be coming in with sometimes conflicting areas that they want to to address as well. So it's a situation where I think you have to sort of see yourself as a learner as well, but also as an educator in that space to help the parent understand that what you're doing is really about amplifying and co-creating a learning opportunity that can be a window, for the child who was. So, yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Morgan.
Can you talk a little bit about social emotional education through a multicultural lens?
Yeah. Dina Simmons is the person who comes to mind related to this notion of social emotional learning. This idea that, we have a label on it now, but it's not necessarily new or innovative. We've been talking about, we know from good research, when we think about the needs, the social, the affective, the work in general, y'all, that we do can be classified in really 3 areas. One is where we spend most of our time in education is in the cognitive domain. Most of what we do is we are focused in on building thinking people, right? Helping them think about complex ideas, helping them build skill sets to analyze, right? So that cognitive domain then is where the majority of us have spent most of our careers, and in fact, your training program is really designed to help students think, right? But a second area related to this work we do is really what's focused in on the affective domain, and that's where a lot of the social and emotional pieces emerge. In other words, the affective domain is really about understanding how feelings, how emotions, emotionality, how we emote, and how that impacts the cognitive, right? And the third area in which we are working is the behavioral domain. And the behavioral domain really is around thinking about, this is where you get behaviorism. This is where you get a lot of the sort of traditional models that don't necessarily take into consideration how human experience and how the social context impacts the behavior, right? So in other words, we're not dealing with robots, right? And so you can't say X, if you do X or Y, then Z is automatically going to happen, right? And so social emotional, the social and emotional piece really is around understanding how all of those areas really interact. Although we talk about SEL really is deeply tied to behavioral, is really deeply tied to cognitive as well. Now, when you talk about it from a multicultural perspective, one of the things that Dina Simmons and other researchers as well, but Dina is the person who the work I've read, and it really is around what happens when school actually is a traumatizing place. What happens when the educational environment is actually so counter productive to the psychology and the emotional states of young people? What do you do then? Maisha Nguyen wrote a powerful book. It's called Justice on Both Sides. And what Maisha, one of the major findings from that book is that sometimes we get it wrong. That is, you might have great intentions, but sometimes you adults, all y'all, right? We get it wrong, right? And so from a multicultural perspective, you have to understand that the work is really about engaging in a level of introspection that allows you to understand how even through your best intentions, you can actually be creating harm as well. So, yes.
I work at a Title I school, and I work at a Title I school, and it's probably 50% or more Latino. The other high percentage is Black. Low income, since it's Title I, everybody 100% lunch. What I have seen is, and it's troubling to me, I see that our kids get yelled at all the time. They get yelled at recess, at lunch, in the classrooms, and the teachers are distraught. We have a lot of behavior problems going on. I know that last year they tried to deal with children in a different way. They let a lot of behaviors slide because kids were just coming back from the pandemic, and there was reported high incidences of suicides within the district. So it's really concerning to me because I look at it and I go, we're becoming destroyers of dreams. And am I doing that in my classroom? And sometimes I think I am. So what do you do with those children who are outright defiant? Those are the parents who do not show up for parent-teacher conference. They will show up when their child is about ready to be RPC'd or suspended. And we know ultimately they really need a lot of love. They need a lot of love, and they can't read. They're in 3rd grade and they can't read. And so there's a lot of different reasons why those kids are angry. So what could you suggest to me so that I don't turn my anger and frustration onto the kids that I am teaching?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I really appreciate your sharing, right? And what I know for sure is that there's an educative moment even now in what you're sharing. There's so much power in the pedagogy of vulnerability. Sometimes I think we walk around like, young people see us often and they're just like, they think one day you just show up and voila, the greatness emerges, right? I'm so awesome, but like if they knew our story, like if you knew my story, if you understood, what I've gone throughout my life and experience, you'd understand that, my standing here in a lot of ways is a miracle, in so many ways. So I think that demonstration of the vulnerable is, puts us in a place where young people will understand that it's a developmental process, right? The other part that I want to make sure that I share here is, and you said a lot, so before you jump back in, I want to try to get through some of what you said, is that you are one person in a complex maze of other individuals who should be working with you. If you see your role like you're some kind of superhero, right? You're going to find yourselves drained, beaten down, and we want you to stay in the profession. We need you to stay in the profession. And so you have got, to your point, you have to understand that you're an important one, you're one person in a team of people. You might be the captain, right? But in a team of people, both within and outside of that space, who should be working with that young person or the young people with whom you're working. So what is your charge? Your charge is to study the student. Your charge is to study the environment. Your charge is to try to understand as much as you possibly can about what that young person needs, and to build a team, right? That team member might be a parent. If the parent doesn't show up, it might be a sibling. If the sibling doesn't show up, it might be a cousin. If the cousin doesn't show up, it might be somebody down the street, right? But it is also about like building and try to understand like, who do I need on my team to be able to support me in this arduous task? Even the best among us, right? Even the best among us are. We find ourselves in situations where it's hard, where we have to struggle. And so there are all of these, mentoring organizations, mentoring opportunities. I'm a member of some organizations that, what we do is mentor, right? And so it might be, and you have to go through, you have to go through the background checks and, but all of those pieces, I think, are important to remember. If we were able to co-create a kind of environment as well, where other people in your school can be, team members and so forth. That's another way of sort of thinking about what it means to engage and to respond.
But see, that's just the thing. team in place.
Okay.
And there's so many people working with, and because it sometimes seems as if it's the same kids. And I'll have other teachers who'll go, oh, that's so-and-so from last year. And so we have teams, and they've really made a huge effort at my school of actually bringing in another vice principal to deal with behavior. And he's really good. And they're doing things like the breakfast club and things like this.
That's good.
But the response of this one young man was, oh, well, Miss so-and-so he's going to just tell me this and this and this. Because I asked him, what is it that's going on? And he says, well, you're just going to tell me the same thing everybody else has done. And I recognize that from working with kids with trauma. People have betrayed your trust over and over and over again. Why should you believe me? And that's the huge barrier that I'm seeing that as a school, we're not able to overcome. And we're not going to be able to overcome it by, at recess, these kids once again are being yelled at. And I'm going, oh my God, if I was going to this school, I would hate this school and want to get out as soon as I can. And I know that part of that is having to change the culture within the school. The individual teachers, in addition to whatever effort they're doing to bring in this resource of this one individual who's working with all these kids and the other support staff that's working with them, and they have an awesome support staff, and they're bringing in sports and these other things. And I'm just hoping that it's not too late.
Okay. Others? Other questions? Yes. Oh, here first, and then we'll come back here. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Okay, so the question that I have for you is that we're noticing across the board that our students are not proficient. How do you feel about us to continue giving them a curriculum where they have no idea about the concepts that came before it, and they're not proficient, they don't know what to do, so they're missing basic skills? How do you feel about that, and what steps would you take or strategies to give to us to help us with our students that are not proficient? They can't read these math problems. Why? Because they don't understand the vocabulary word. They missed something in 4th grade. Now they're in 7th, and they're struggling.
Yeah, I think what's really important to remember is that you have to, and I know it's going to sound like it's common sense, right? But with all the pressures and the stresses of what the administration is saying, but you've got to meet the students where they are. One piece of advice I give every school district in which I work is that every teacher in that school should be a teacher of literacy, right? And what that means is the science teacher is a teacher of literacy, because reading an information text is qualitatively different than reading a novel, right? And so building the skill set to help that young person or to help the students, build literacy, the reading skills, I think is really important. And I think also foundationally, if we can increase instructional time, and it's not just increasing instructional time for the sake of having a body in the room, but what we know for the research is when effective, high quality, relevant engagement is a part of what the young students or what the students' experiences are, they have a better shot at filling some of the deficiencies or the challenges that they have, right? So I would say, and I think some of this is on the district's level, like trying to increase, even if you can add, what the research would show is if you can add 15 or 20 minutes per subject to, with high quality instruction, you have a better chance of getting students to where they need to be. Some of this also might show up. That's why, summer programs and that are really academically based, right? Coupled with the social and emotional pieces, right? Can really be a difference maker. I can point to like Nashville, Tennessee, for instance. Like we saw huge increases with some of the students in the area of literacy in 2021 because of the accelerated summer programs that they had. So on an individual classroom level, I would say really try to increase engaged instruction time. I think some of these, baseline, and you're math, right? Okay, so much fun doing math. But increasing, and and again, I'm sure you have all of these online resources as well, and engaging, increasing our students' opportunities to engage in that as well. On a structural level, though, I would say after school, summer, and you're continuing to teach, whatever the higher level expectation is, but you're also spending some dedicated time every single day on the baseline of if it's math facts, if it's subtraction and addition. Like you just say, we're gonna hit this every day, for 10 minutes. And the other thing, educators, that I want to remind you and encourage you to do is you got to become data gatherers in your work. Your work has to be guided. The decisions you make have to be guided by what you're learning with the young people with whom you're working. What does that mean? I don't mean you develop a whole research study. That's not what I mean. But what I mean is when you see something that is working, or when you see a challenge that you're finding, you have to document it, right? So that you can tell the story. Your administrators in your school, they're not your enemies, right? Sometimes they're disconnected to the reality of what's happening in your particular discipline. But so your job then is to provide a level of insight so that the administrators can say, oh, okay, we need more time, or you need to spend more time on the foundational aspects of human learning and development. Does that make sense? Okay, yeah. And in terms of, I'll use the example of Project Talk that most of you saw earlier. That project started in 2009. And there are initiatives, and I just want to encourage y'all here for a second. There are initiatives that start and they go nowhere. There are outstanding things that you might do as an individual in classes or in classrooms, right? But then there are things that you might be able to do that become a part of that can be difference and life-changing for the entire school. So the challenge then is if you know that your babies are struggling with math facts, then you might create some kind of innovative way to say, you might be worn out at the end of the day, but you might be able to say, I'm gonna get a grant. I'm gonna partner with the folks at UNLV. I'm gonna figure out a way. We're gonna call on some of these brilliant minds at the university to come and tutor and to work and be mentors with the student, so that it then becomes something that's baked in the fabric of what's happening. We also have, and I know I'm going on and on and on here, but we also have all of these retired educators, right, who in many instances could bring expertise and insights. And, they might give you an hour or two, 2 or 3 days a week to be able to supplement and complement. So when you think about the team approach, it's also about working outside of the walls of the space to try to figure out ways to supplement and complement. Yes.
Thank you so much. A shout out to my 2 prior educators, especially the math educator. Yeah. I teach sixth grade. Math? Yes, I teach 6th grade math at a middle school, at a local middle school. I very much appreciate the comment regarding the disciplinary approach that has been unsuccessful, that makes us feel guilty whenever we're dealing with children. So 2 very quick comments and then a question. It was brought to my attention by a veteran educator at the school where I teach. He said to me, if the students have a certain behavior at home, in their community, and among their friends, it's almost, God forbid that we should say it, we're almost fighting a losing battle. If 80% of the time their behavior is acceptable, the bad behavior, let's just say it, is acceptable in all of these other venues, by the time they come to school, they feel like, why should it be any different? That's what I think she was saying. That's what we're up against when you're trying to focus on the cognitive and academic accomplished strategies to get kids engaged. You're dealing with behaviors, not just a behavioral, quote unquote, behavioral situation, but someone whose behavior is acceptable in every other aspect of their life, even with their parents. Because I've heard students tell their parents, yikes.
You're saying a lot, so I want to take notes so I can
Okay.
capture some.
I thought it was
Like
so
I didn't
bad.
leave.
Elvis has left the building. Okay, no.
I apologize, but I'm like, let me, because I want to capture some, because I know you have some other things to say, so I want to make sure
Right. And so
I can
I
capture
wanted
some.
to move on
Yeah.
that same
But keep
note.
going. I don't want you to miss your point. I'm sorry.
Okay, and so I had one student tell me, and I'm cutting through a lot of discussion. I said to that student, well, this is just common sense. And the student looked at me and said, maybe common sense isn't all that common. And I froze with this idea that we have, and we can't help it, in order to survive and to live in all aspects of our life, we have a fixed perspective that allows us to survive on so many different levels. So when we come into a classroom, our expectation as educators is sometimes superseded by our feelings as just people. And then the children come to us with so many different backgrounds. But it was brought to my attention after this educator said 15, 16 years in middle school. And in middle school, of course, is the most problematic. These kids, their behavior is off the chain in every other aspect of their life. And then they come to school and they feel like there's nothing any different. So on the previous educator in mathematics, I have students who really cannot read. It's really, and I'm not sure if I have a question or what can you do? They absolutely, and of course we're in childhood literacy in our ARL program. So there's decoding, word recognition, and then there's language comprehension. The kids can decode, thank God, but there's no language comprehension. I will ask them questions on the test and it goes right over their head. So there's the behavioral side. I'm not saying I don't like the word. I think it's more than just behavior in terms of the theoretical side of what behavioral situations are. It is that these kids have so much out there in their life, and they're constantly at odds with something. So when they come into the school, they're still at odds with you and everything else that you're trying to teach them.
Thank you so much in that. And I want to welcome other people as well, because I think you brought some perspectives as well that were insightful. So we can co-create some responses here. One of the things that I would say is that what I've observed is young people adapt and they make adjustments based on the cultural norms and the cultural expectations of a space, right? So, which is why you see one child who, let's say in middle school, classroom A, they're turning flips, flipping the desks, whatever, cussing the teacher out, and they go to the next class and they feel like a completely. Am I the only one who observes that? They're like a very different person in that second space, right? And so it is the co-creation of what that space is and what the expectations are in that. And I'm using the word co-creation here because it's very important. The thesis of these kids are out of control really is these kids are out of control and they should be. And the reason that thesis is the sort of permeating piece there is that people resist this notion of being controlled when you're controlling their bodies, right? So one of the ways that we find from the research is that you try to co-create a place, right, with students or with young people so that you decide how we're going to do things up in here, right? If the norm or the expectation is you're going to do X, Y, or Z or else, what's going to probably happen is, students are going to do or else, and they're not going to be up in that classroom, right? And so the mindset and the perspective has to be that we're going to co-create, and I'm the adult in here. Let me be clear here, right? So I'm the person responsible for what happens in here, but we're going to decide on how we want to engage and be with each other, in that, in this environment. The second piece that I would add is that from a relationship perspective, there are times when young people will say, I want to can I go see Coach blah, blah, blah? Or can I go, sit in Miss Jones's class? Or, because they've been able to sort of develop a relationship with those adults in ways. And not that, let me just be clear that it's not that I'm saying that Miss Jones or Coach Lee or whoever it happens to be is easy or is going to allow me to get away with anything I want to get away with. But there's a relational aspect of what happens where there's a mutual set of agreements, if you will, on how things are going to be. Right? So I'm a big college football person, and Nick Saban, and Nick Saban, let's just say, is a pretty good coach, right? At Alabama. Any of y'all ever heard of Nick Saban? Anybody? Okay. Roll Tide. Okay, we got some Roll Tide. Okay. I'm not an Alabama fan, but for this purposes, I'll share some of what I learned from Saban. So there were some student athletes who were being interviewed about Nick Saban, and they were saying, you work so hard. It just sounds like, you wake up early to do PT. You stay late. You're just so engaged in this program. What is it about Coach Saban, that pushes you into a place where it's almost like you'll walk through a brick wall for Coach Saban? What is it? And those young people said, yeah, because we believe Coach Saban will walk through a brick wall for us. Now, I don't get a lot from Coach Saban, right? Because I'm not a fan of his football program necessarily, but that was a powerful point, right? This notion that our young people, are y'all still out there with me? Our young people should feel like we will walk through a brick wall for them, right? And part of that walking through the brick wall, and it doesn't mean that every day is going to be perfect and sunshine. It doesn't mean that there are not going to be days. I had a student, and he was a 10th grader, and let's just say he cussed me out many days, cussed me out, right? And there were moments when it was hurtful. It was hurtful. We would have that, he would come in some days and say, we would have a bad day. The next day he'd come in and be like, we cool, Milner. I'd be like, you're cool, but I'm still hurt, right? But again, it was this, I was determined that I was going to try to do and be the best version of Milner I could be every single day, right? And that meant that there were days when not very much teaching happened, to be frank. There were days when I felt like, when I was on the drive home, there were days when I felt like, what am I doing? I added very little value on this day. But guess what? The next day, it got a little bit better. So the totality of what happens in this work is what you have to think about. You got to think about there are going to be days where you might feel like very little has taken place on this day, right? But you got to stick with it. You got to stay the course. You got to keep trying. You got to keep pressing, because if you keep pressing, I promise you, something's going to get through. Something is going to get through. And that, for that student who would cuss me out, and I'm not going to call the student's name, or so forth. Every now and then, I reflect on what are some of the lessons, or what are some of the things that the student did get. The other thing that I think is to think about is, how can you look at the behavior that you might see as problematic, challenging? What aspects of that behavior can you see from an assets perspective, right? The student who talks loudly, the student who enters the class late, the student who cusses you out. How do you change your paradigm for what you are observing? I had a student who would literally commentate with everything I was saying. I got one more minute? You got to be kidding me. Oh, okay. So I lost my train of thought. Oh, so who would literally, and I would say, come on up. You come up and teach. You're gonna teach with me. You're gonna work with me. Come on up, right? So in the beginning, I was just like, I wish she would just let me get a word in. Like, please be quiet, right? But I had to change. I had to, and then eventually she'd be like, "No, Milner, I'm not coming up here today. I'm gonna sit back here. I'm not gonna do any work." but I'm going to sit back here, today, right? And so I realized that along the way, and there are going to be moments like that. There are going to be moments when your students are going to say, I'm not doing any work today. That's a hard place to be, because when I was growing up, I didn't tell adults I wasn't going to do any work today, right? I just didn't, right? But for some of the young people, they might be in places we don't know what young people are going through. We don't know what people are grappling with, right? And so on those days when those students would tell me they're not doing any work, I would try to always add some kind of value. It might be one thing today, right? It might be one point they might get across. They might write one sentence that week, right? They might solve one problem that day, right? But that's one step forward, right? That's one step forward. The work is challenging, it's nuanced. If it were easy, as good as I am, and I'm great, right? I would tell you, that's not this kind of science. That's not the work you're in. It's not, right? It's part of it's the challenge of saying, I'm going to keep pressing. The challenge of saying, I'm not going to give up. The challenge of saying, I'm going to focus on discipline versus punishment. Discipline is about, every day, trying, pressing, moving forward, trying to build a muscle, trying to get the student where we want, or the students where we want and we need them to be. So I know I'm out of time, and so hopefully it was something that was said that was helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you.